Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to The Politics of the Portrait, a three-part series exploring the role of portraiture, Black and Brown representation in art. I'm Maryam Ohadi-Hamadani, a postdoctoral research associate here at the Center for British Art, and I'm delighted to have you all join us today. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We're also using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions, and they will be answered at the end of the program during the discussion session. And feel free, please, to drop those questions into the Q&A at any time during this discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to get to all of the questions today. Yale University also acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now known as the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people, my people, and nations in this land. So without further ado, I'll begin. I'll be giving an introduction, and then our speakers, Zirwat Chowdhury, Bridget R, and Edward Town will present their presentation, and then we'll end with a discussion session. And that's when you can, of course, ask those questions, and hopefully we'll be able to answer those. One outcome of the Black Lives Matter protests across the United States and Britain last summer was that public monuments to slave owners and colonizers were torn down, destroyed, graffitied, their demise photographed, and disseminated across mass media. Take, for example, the story of the monument to 17th century merchant Edward Colston in the city center of Bristol, England. At surface level, the statue represents one man cast in bronze atop a pedestal of Portland stone. Yet this seemingly harmless sculpture belies its historical, social, and political contexts. Firstly, in terms of Colston's own life. As an agent of the Royal African Company, he profited in part from an increasingly lucrative slave trade, a business that helped to create an empire at the violent subjugation of others. Secondly, the inception of the monument and life itself is significant. As the commemorative plaque reads on the monument, it was erected in 1895 as a, quote, memorial to one of the most virtuous and wise sons of our city. That year, the recently formed Imperial British East Africa Company, not to be confused with Colston's company, which dissolved in 1850, formally colonized Kenya, having already colonized Uganda the year prior. And finally, the most recent afterlife of this monument is important too. Concerted efforts to take it down because of Colston's ties to slavery began in the 1990s. And as you can see in Hugh Locke's work here from 2006, this monument has a long-standing reputation. Here, the image of the monument is covered with symbols of power, of colonialism and war, carrying, as Locke would say, the burden of this history. Finally, in the wake of the George Floyd protest, it was toppled and tossed into Bristol Harbor, the same harbor that had been one port of entry for the triangular slave trade. The statue was then recovered and installed at the Shed Museum, and about a month later, the artist Mark Quinn, with a team of 10, secretly erected on the empty plinth another statue honoring protester Jen Reed, immediately taken down by the Bristol City Council, an intervention that was met with both praise and criticism. As historian David Alyoshoga said, this recent history transformed the statue from what he called a mediocre piece of late Victorian public art into the most important artifact in Britain if you want to tell the story of Britain's torturous relationship with its role in the Atlantic slave trade. So what does this event tell us about portraits or of Black and Brown representation in Western art? Art history is as much about aesthetics as it is about the context that tell us why an object was created, how it was presented to viewers at its inception and throughout its lifespan, and what objects are considered important enough for preservation, or in many cases, what objects are forgotten or destroyed. Ideally, museums are the spaces in which we preserve our colonial or cultural objects, contextualize them through historical narratives, and teach viewers about their significance. But who gets to be represented and in what ways? Representation is about power, portraits are about power. In the wake of these protests in 2020, the Yale Center for British Art began a research project on this painting, which depicts one of Yale University's benefactors with an enslaved child. Like many other representations of people of African descent in British paintings from this period, although the boy depicted is likely drawn from real life, his identity is still unknown. In the fall of 2020, contemporary artist Titus Kafar's Enough About You was installed in the center's long-term collection galleries in place of the Lahu Yell painting. Kafar explained the impetus behind this direct response to this 18th century painting, stating, "I wanted to find a way to imagine a life for this young man that the historical painting had never made space for in the composition, his desires, dreams, family, thoughts, hopes. Those things were never subjects that the original artist wanted the viewer to contemplate." What does it mean to center the lives of Black figures in historical portraiture when they weren't historically centered in the first place? And I'm speaking here of their own lives and biographies written out of the labels on the museum's wall, often absent from history and the archival record, and in the paintings compositionally sidelined, or in many cases cut out of the painting altogether. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule, as you see here with another object in our collection, which Ed will be touching upon today. But as Peter Brathwaite, the opera singer and BBC broadcaster, pointed out during his 50-day Rediscovering Black Portraiture project on social media, inspired by the Getty's lockdown challenge to recreate works of art from home, it became increasingly difficult for him to find historical paintings that did center Black figures in their own right. As with the Kafar painting, the reparative act of replacing a historical painting depicting an enslaved servant with a contemporary one restoring agency for the unnamed child is one possible alternative. The representation of an enslaved servant of African descent, as is more commonly known, but there are also examples of South Asian servitude too, is a genre in British and European painting displaying certain visual conventions that reinforce the power of the main sitter. These visual conventions, once reserved for the wealthy European elite, are for Kehinde Wiley sources for Black self-actualization. Currently on display in our galleries is Wiley's 2017 portrait of the artist Lynette Yaya Damboache, based on the 18th century painting Jacob Moreland of Capelthwaite. Surrounded by grand manner portraits by Reynolds and Gainsborough, the monumental painting of this artist's commands a presence on such a scale as to diminish the power of those around it, placing the Black figure front and center. These examples lead us to consider what is at stake when paintings like the Yell painting and others in our collection, as shown here, which visualize traumatic and violent episodes of our past, remain on display. How can we diminish the power of these historical objects without reifying that power by making them visible to viewers? Does their absence, as it has been argued, erase that chapter of our history, make us forget our past? Let's return to the story of the Colston Monument. Its toppling was one reaction to the continued hypervisibility of violence inflicted on Black and then Asian bodies in the media in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the pandemic, ironically made invisible here by the seemingly harmless image of a man in a waistcoat, curled wig, and breeches. But like the proliferation of Confederate monuments here in the southern United States during the era of Jim Crow in the early 20th century, erected to terrorize Black citizens and to reify white supremacy, sometimes it isn't about what is seen, but that which is unseen, that which is absent. The Colston Monument, like the Robert E. Lee Monument that sparked Charlottesville, no longer sits on a pedestal in the city center. It lies on its side, graffiti still fresh, and the museum is currently crowdsourcing its website visitors for their opinion on what to do with it. A year after the protests last summer, here at the center, we too are reckoning with objects in our collection, considering how we can contextualize them in a way that is more inclusive and relevant to our audiences today, and what it means to be caretakers for the largest collection of British art outside of Britain. What are some new approaches and methodologies in art historical practice and curatorial practice that might provide more equitable narratives? What are the possibilities of art history and curatorial practice in recovering and resituating Black and Brown representation and portraiture? Today, our panelists, Edward Town, Zirwat Chowdhury, and Bridget R. consider potential solutions and alternatives regarding the history, display, and making of portraits and the role of representation in today's sociopolitical climate. Dr. Zirwat Chowdhury's research and teaching explores the interconnected histories and historiographies of art and visual culture in Britain, France, and South Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries. Her current book project, Enlightened Relations, Art Without Common Sense in Late 18th and Early 19th Century Britain and Colonial South Asia, traces within the intertwined networks of British and South Asian art and visual culture an alternative history to the late Enlightenment conceptualization of sympathy. As editor of Journal 18, dedicated to research of art of the 17th and 18th centuries, Dr. Chowdhury initiated an interactive timeline to chronicle the representation and regulation of Black bodies in Europe between 1600 and 1800 in order to provide a collaborative resource for teaching, research, and collective discussion around these issues. Through internationally crowdsourcing material online, the timeline offers, in Chowdhury's words, a way for putting artworks, historical events, and actors across the globe in spatial and visual relation to one another, in order to provide further nuance to the juxtapositions and connections of Black representation in European art. Chowdhury's work represents one pedagogical tool for rethinking the canonical narratives of art history. Leading the team conducting research on the Allahu Yell painting, Dr. Edward Town will discuss the ways in which object-based technical art history tells us about Black representation in historical British portraiture. One result of this ongoing research is an article on the Center's website, which offers new insight into the painting. Dr. Town, along with our Center colleagues from the Conservation Department, Jessica David and Richard Hart, have conducted technical research that considers the materiality and processes of painting Black and brown flesh tones. Dr. Town will also consider the role of the University Museum as a center for academic learning. And finally, Bridget R. Cook's research centers on exhibition histories of Black artists and contemporary Black artists invested in representation. Cook's award-winning 2011 book, Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans in the American Art Museum, examined ways that museums have perpetuated racial inequity through the presentation and curation of Black artists. Cook's most recent project, The Black Index, is an exhibition showcasing works by contemporary artists Dennis Delgado, Alicia Henry, Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle, Titus Kaphar, Whitfield Lovell, and Lava Thomas, which in Cook's words, builds upon the tradition of Black self-representation as an antidote to colonialist images. This exhibition, accompanied by a catalog, is currently on view at the Palo Alto Art Center, where it will then travel to the Warfield Center's Art Gallery at UT Austin, my own alma mater, in the fall, and then Hunter College Art Galleries in winter of 2022. The artists here consider photography as documentary and offers an alternative to pre-existing conditions of historical Black representation by interrupting traditional narratives of portraiture and representation. So please join me again in welcoming Ed, Zirwat, and Bridget to today's panel discussion. And now we'll have our first presentation.
Thank you, Maryam and the Yale Center for British Art for this invitation to contribute to this conversation today. And Maryam, thank you for the introduction to the timeline. I thought I would take this opportunity to offer you a kind of cursory introduction to the timeline and also take you through a constellation of some of the dates, events, artworks that come across in this timeline, maybe to offer a kind of history of Blackness that might emerge in this timeline and that we can plot in this timeline around the painting that Dr. Town will talk about later today of the Elihu Yale portrait. So as Maryam mentioned, this is a timeline project, a crowdsourced project that my fellow editors and I did at Journal 18 last summer between June and September 2020. It was very much coming out of the circumstances of living in lockdown. We wanted to do a collaborative project as a way to build community with our readers, to engage new contributors, and also really to recognize they weren't certainly unprecedented cries, but the newly escalated cries for racial justice that came to the fore last summer. And so we really thought about, as I mentioned, wanting to do a crowdsourced project, both as a way of stepping beyond the limitations of our own expertise, but also to really engage with our community of readers. And the goal was to create a timeline that could chronicle, as Maryam mentioned, the representation and regulation of Black bodies in Europe between 1600 and 1800. And I should note that Blackness, as Maryam indicated in her own introduction, encompasses a wider geography and refers both to African diasporic peoples and South Asians in this period. And that is something we wanted to put in conversation with one another as well. Also, Blackness, as we trace it and chronicle it in this timeline, is not just an inventory of, Black sitters who appear across different works of European art between the 17th and 18th centuries. But in fact, we wanted to make room for Blackness as both as visual convention, as colonial category, and as lived experience, because we wanted to see how we could understand this mode of representation at the intersections of these three categories that I mentioned. So just to repeat, visual convention, colonial category, and lived experience. And so, Maryam, if you could give me the next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of this, so, if you clicked forward to 1766, you might see this portrait of the Marquess of Granby with his now unnamed attendant from 1766. And I wanted to choose this particular portrait because unlike some of the other portraits that we see where we often see these very subordinated, docile, attendants who are kind of marginalized at the corner of the painting, and there's certainly certain acts of marginalization in operation in this portrait too, there's also a really fascinating act of mutual indifference, I think, that comes across between the two sitters. And in particular, I wanted to draw your attention to a convention that we embraced in identifying the titles of the artworks that appear in the timeline. And so, as I discussed in my short introduction that I provide to the timeline that you can see by going to our website, we embrace the convention now unnamed attendant in lieu of Black page, servant, or enslaved servant to underscore that names are now unknown to us because of processes of erasure. Attendant, with its etymological tie to a sense of awaiting, also has the potential to subvert the function of servitude and docility often attributed to such figures. It elucidates instead the intransigent subjects who hovered in households that they wished anything but to serve. Indeed, not all Black subjects attended, setting fire to plantations, towns, and houses, and often running away. Many seized their own presence, however precariously and fugitively, in striving towards alternative futures. And I really invite the Yale Center for British Art to consider the adoption of a similar convention, and as it reviews the titles and conventions of its own artworks, of its curatorial practice as well. So with this in mind, I'd like to take you, as I mentioned, through a constellation of events that appear in this timeline, perhaps as a way to think and engage with the Yale portrait that Ed will tell us a bit more about shortly. So Maryam, if I could get the next slide. So as you'll see, the figure who's made prominent in Titus Kafar's response and reimagination of the Yale portrait is the figure referred to as the child, and that the timeline would certainly identify as a now unnamed attendant. And I wanted us to linger a little bit about this matter of this emphasis on the child, the figure of the child, and to think about the status of the child within this history of colonial legislation. So on the timeline in 1662, one might encounter colonial legislation that was enacted in Virginia, and that was implemented pretty widely across really the French and British empires about how the status of a child born into enslavement would follow the condition of the mother. And that therefore, even though, as we know well from the important historical research of scholars, that sexual violence was such a central and traumatic feature of plantation slavery, that this question of paternity and maternity is as inextricably linked to how we come to understand who is the figure of a child. How can we also center these histories of reproductive labor and sexual violence as we bring attention to the figures who populate these paintings as well? On the right, you'll see, for example, in 1713, just a few years before the Yale portrait is understood to have been made now, Britain was granted the asiento at the conclusion of the Wars of Spanish Succession. And so it was through the granting of the asiento that Britain really is able to enter. Britain is already a participant in the transatlantic slave trade, but it is really with the asiento that it becomes ascendant in that network of slavery as well. If you'll go to the next slide, Maryam, but I also wanted to make room for some of the laws that are not only regulating the liberation and freedoms of Black bodies, that also illuminate for us how Black individuals in Europe in particular, and certainly this happens in the colonies as well, laid claim upon the law to seek protection, to make claim for protection as well. So for example, in 1701 and 1706, as you might see on the top of the slide, there were important legislations that were passed or court cases in Britain that acknowledged that the condition of enslavement did not transfer neatly from the colonies to Britain necessarily. Of course, this was not necessarily the case in practice, but that it illuminates for us how it is that individuals of African diasporic, or South Asian ancestry were also making claims to visibility and to various notions of freedom in Britain. Of course, this goes hand in hand with something like 1729, which is a little later than the portrait, but certainly has echoes throughout the late 17th and 18th centuries of petitions by the West Indian lobby to request Parliament to affirm the rights of enslavers. So there's constantly a debate, as much as we saw, for example, the colonial law about the condition of the mother being passed on to the child. The slave codes that were enacted in the colonies, from the 1660s onwards, are constantly being regulated, often being made stricter. But in certain cases, there are also debates about whether to limit the rights and really the violences of plantation owners as well. So I just wanted to put these things in conversation. And then finally, Maryam, if I can see the next slide, I also wanted to discuss, as much as we're talking about how to center Blackness, how to make room for histories of Blackness within these other histories of European art, that I also wanted to just draw your attention to some of the ways in which whiteness was made into a more normative category in Europe. So for example, on the left, you'll see in 1664, the scientist Robert Boyle, whom we know mainly in terms of his important scientific research for the Royal Society, that Boyle was also undertaking various experiments to determine the nature of the color of skin. And that within his studies, he argued that whiteness was the normative category, that even Black individuals were actually white, was his argument. So that there are these different ways in which what Blackness is understood as a racialized category, as a kind of, and as a racial category, both in terms of like the biblical categories, the races of man, but also increasingly in terms of geographical and climate-based specificity, that this is beginning to center certain notions of whiteness as well. And then finally, I just want to bring your attention to this law from 1733 that was enacted in Jamaica that determined that a free person 4 generations removed from African ancestry could be legally white. But of course, as scholars have noted, at this point in Jamaica, nobody could actually claim that status as well. So these are some of the ways, I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the ways in which whiteness was also centered within these histories of European art. So I will leave it at that for today. And I really, invite your questions. And I hope you'll take this opportunity to go through the timeline. One thing I wanted to note is that instead of offering detailed entries on different artworks, what we chose is to really, we provide references with the different entries in the timeline, and we invite our readers to participate in what we call a system of cross-reference. This is something that, we wanted to emulate from the 18th century encyclopédie, that it is through, your movement through the timeline, your contrasts and comparison of different dates, artworks, events, that perhaps we, the users of our timeline can also start to use the timeline as a resource rather than as something to learn passively from. So thank you, Maryam.
Good afternoon, everyone. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to return us to the collection at the Yale Center for British Art, which is where I'm calling from today. If I were to step outside of this office and walk into the galleries, I'd encounter approximately a quarter of the paintings and sculpture collection on display. And the slide that you're seeing here shows the opening bays to the 4th floor. As you can see from the photograph, many of the works, some of which we've seen in Maryam's presentation already, are portraits. You're seeing the portrait of a man by Francis Harwood in the foreground. Then behind that, to the right, at a oblique angle, the portrait by Tilly Kettle, which was the opening slide to this series of talks, paintings by Reynolds, a further portrait by Kettle. On the left, the large double portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds, and right in the background, Kehinde Wiley's portrait of the artist Lynette Damboache. Today, I'm going to be talking about an ongoing research project on an 18th century painting in the center's collection that began last summer and reached an important milestone in the publication on the center's website of the findings that have been made to date. This is not the first time the painting has been the focus of attention. In 2014, after years off display, the painting was hung in the opening bay of the exhibition Figures of Empire, Slavery and Portraiture in 18th Century Atlantic Britain. Alongside the university's early benefactor, the namesake, Elihu Yale, and members of his family, is a child who can be no older than 10 years old. The metal collar around his neck takes us immediately to one of the darkest contours of British history, and one of the most invidious aspects of Britain's entrenchment in the slave trade during the period. That is the practice of bringing children, often boys, from Africa, India, or Britain's Atlantic colonies to serve as attendants in households within Britain's shoreline. Portraits of this period provide a record of this often forgotten history. As we've heard, in 2020, Titus Kafar's Enough About You was brought as a loan to the Yale Center for British Art and hung in place of the 18th century painting. We heard Maryam read Kafar's statement about this work, which takes the composition of the earlier painting, collapses much of it, and transforms the hierarchy of representation. It also demands an immediate reckoning with the troubling depiction of the enslaved child, which in Kafar's painting is shown defiant and rid of his collar. This provided the center with the opportunity to conduct the first technical study of the painting. Indeed, this must be one of the very first technical studies of this type of group portrait. If we can just go back for 1 second to the previous slide, you'll see the program of analysis was conducted in tandem with a study of another version of the painting, also at Yale, which is of the same composition, albeit on a far smaller scale and on a different support. So whereas the center's painting is a large oil painting on canvas, the version which is owned by the Yale University Art Gallery across the road is on copper. In the absence of any surviving paper archive that records the circumstance in which the center's painting was made and that at the Yale University Art Gallery, we have to turn to the painting itself and mine it as if it were an archive. Here on the left, you're looking at a cross-section taken from the painting and a microphotograph showing the area of the picture in which it was taken. That is, the blue coat worn by one of the men in the foreground. Sure enough, new knowledge came to us that had a transformative effect on our understanding of the two paintings. The discovery of the pigment Prussian blue, which is the darker set of particles you're seeing in this displayed cross-section, invented, as the name suggests, in Prussia in 1709, and only reaching the palettes of painters in England about a decade later, made the long-standing interpretation of both paintings immediately untenable. It gave us a new date for the painting and unlocked the true identities of some of the sitters. So here you're seeing the identities of the figures in the foreground that had stuck with the picture for the best part of a century. And in the following slide, you'll see the new set of identities that we were able to establish. And yet, the identity of the child remains unknown. While some artists in London, as these three slides show, made studies of children of African and Indian heritage and reuse those studies in the same way they reuse drawings of costume, flowers, and other compositional elements, it's my sense that regardless, nearly all are portraits derived from life. I just want to linger on this slide for a second. You can see the three portraits of the white women by the artist William Vissing depict different women, but wearing identical costume, and the right proper hand of each of those women is derived from the same pattern. This is a template. This is a means by which a workshop could produce a number of portraits, and yet it's the same child that appears in each three pictures. There's no relationship between these women beyond them being court elites. Interesting as well. Sorry, just to go back for 1 second to that previous slide. Interesting on the left that the child of African heritage is depicted by Vissing as a boy, and my reading of the other two paintings is that the same child is on the right in the guise of a young girl. Thank you very much. So knowing the correct identities for the other sitters in the center's painting provides us with avenues for further research in order to try and recover the identity of the child. Now that we know that the man in the blue coat is Yale's son-in-law, Dudley North, we can mine his archive, his surviving papers, for any record of the child's existence during the 17 teens. There were certainly children of colour in the household of Dudley North's wider family. Here you're looking at the parish registers of the Church of St. Martin in the Fields. That's the church that overlooks Trafalgar Square in London. And if we just click through to show the entry in question, we know that there is a baptism record for a child called Francis Juba. You can see this is entry 10. And Lord Guildford is one of Dudley North's close relatives. So Juba was an attendant of the Norths who, when he left the household, trained as a barber, later returning to the same family much later in life. And this is a case in point. Juba was actually from India, but has demonstrated, here he's described simply as black, those two things being conflated. To be sure, the child in the center's painting is not Francis Juba. His life may have taken a similar course, or like many of the young men and women who lived in Britain in the 18th century from Africa and India in this, or Britain's overseas colonies, in this ill-defined but often violently enforced state of servitude, he may have run away. And here you're seeing just one of a series of advertisements published in British newspapers seeking the recovery of a self-emancipated attendant, described there as a page within an aristocratic family. At present, we don't know what happened next in this child's life. Kafar's work encourages to imagine that life, though, and provides an insistence that we continue to center this child's biography whenever thinking about this painting, and indeed other pictures that employ similar modes of representation. A couple of final thoughts before I pass over to Bridget. I'm showing here a portrait used in David Olusoga's seminal Black and British, A Forgotten History. You see here illustrated as one of the color plates. Research undertaken some years ago by the curators of the Figures of Empire exhibition suggested a new identity for the white sitter, who'd previously been misidentified and was in fact a man called Charles Goring, who lived at a country house called Wiston in Sussex. Next slide, please. Close comparison with another portrait of Goring confirms this suggestion, while the discovery of tranche of his family's papers, discovered at Wiston, which you can see bottom right, opens up the possibility of learning more about his child attendant, depicted in the center's painting. Next slide, please. It's only careful, close looking, comparison and study, I would suggest, that will lead to further breakthroughs. Only recently, the Centre was informed by colleagues in Britain that a painting in our collection, next slide, please, is known through two other versions that we're seeing, which likely depicts, far left, a man named Gerarmo Bardoletti, a salaried member of the household of Sir William Morgan, the man in the orange coat. As the three examples I've discussed show, there is much to learn about these portraits and the complex histories they represent.
Hi, good evening and good morning and good afternoon to everybody around the world who's tuning in, as we used to say in the 20th century. I'm Bridget Cooks. I'm thankful and delighted to be with you. Just want to thank Courtney Martin for her leadership of the Yale Center, and to Maryam Ohadi-Hamadani for inviting me to be part of this event with Dr. Edward Town, with Zirwat Chowdhury. And the two women behind the scenes who are making all this go so smoothly, Jane Nawasatko and Linda Payne, these things really take a team. So I appreciate everyone. I'm going to speak a bit about a more contemporary discourse around Black portraiture. And I really want to also suggest that what's at stake in all of this discussion is conceptualization and the possibility of the perception of Black subjectivity, right? That we're talking about the visual arts and we're talking about representation and the messages that we get, but that all of those things are part of, or they're symptomatic of, a larger antagonism. And that is thinking about Black people as subjects. So what I'm going to do briefly and stay on time is just to give you some examples of how contemporary African-American artists have been addressing this possibility of Black subjectivity through portraiture. So I'll start with my favorite museum revolutionary, Fred Wilson, and his incredible exhibition artwork, Mining the Museum from 1992. And this is, pardon the blurriness of this photograph, but him training staff at the Maryland Historical Society to tour his work, Mining the Museum, which was a collaboration with a space called The Contemporary in Baltimore. And if we go to the next slide, we can see one of the rooms in which he reinstalled the collection of objects owned by the Maryland Historical Society. He didn't actually make any artworks physically himself. What he did was mine the museum's collection, the Historical Society's collection, and rearrange them so that they told another story. So I'm focusing here on the painting that you see on the left, the Justice Englehart Cunn painting of Henry Darnall III. And then if we click a bit, just one slide, I want to just show you a sense of discovery that took place in the gallery. And if you can find a copy of the catalog for Mining the Museum, it's really my favorite exhibition catalog. It was published after the exhibition was closed. And what you would do in that installation space that we just showed is you'd walk up to the painting and the lights would go dim, and then a spotlight would highlight the young Black boy who you see on the left. And then a vocal recording would ask these questions: who combs my hair? Who calms me when I'm afraid? Who makes me laugh? And if we show just this brief animation on the right, I'm just showing you here the way that focusing on the Black subject, right, was recreated in this cutout feature in the catalog. I want to make clear here, I mean, I show this painting every year to the students that I teach at East Irvine. And we think about this perhaps as a painting of two people. I think that is true. And yet it really is a portrait of one person. Everything in this painting is telling us about the central figure, this young boy, Darnall III, in the center. And then the purpose of having the Black boy is to help us focus on the wealth of this young man, the land that he owns, the Black boy, who may be even older than the central figure, is telling us with his silver collar and his look over to the young white boy in the middle that the central figure is not only most important, but certainly more important than the Black boy. So sometimes I think we want to think about this as a kind of double portrait, but it's important to, in my mind, consider the power relations and really think about a kind of social function that the visual representation of Blackness fills. And so we're not seeing this as a portrait of the Black boy, right? That portraiture I'm suggesting suggests agency and subjectivity, as my colleagues have already expressed. And part of what I want to talk about is that reclamation or claiming of Black subjectivity that Fred Wilson was able to suggest with Mining the Museum. We can go to the next slide. This is an artwork from Titus Kaphar that's also owned by Yale across the street at the Yale University Art Gallery, Nourishing a Nation. And I wanted to show this because it's part of Yale's collection and because also it provides a kind of historical relationship with Kaphar's contemporary practice. What we're looking at here is a collage. In his practice, often after he finishes a major body of work and then wants to move on to something else, he'll do these collages to sort of reinvigorate him and his imagination. If we go to the next slide, I want you to see where he's sourcing his images from. He's very capacious in his research and a kind of visual appetite. So I want to just walk through these three sources and then talk about the fourth briefly. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see this Fontaine and Porter photograph called Family in the Garden, The Hidden Witness. And this is a memorial or a memory, a funerary image where we see a white family sitting on and standing around a bench facing us, the viewer. And then in the background, if you look to the left, leaning on a tree, is a Black man, an enslaved man, who is holding a shovel, and he's looking away in the distance. And just above him, just to the right of the tree, is a Black woman who's also enslaved and working for the family. And so The Hidden Witness is a really wonderful photograph for us to look at when we're thinking about enslavement, power relations, and the ways that those antagonisms between Blacks and whites have been fixed in photography. And here, the Black people are shown to be at a distance. The Black man in particular is shown as an object of labor, ready to dig the grave. Also looking sorrowful and forlorn in the background at a distance from the family, not mourning at the same level. And this mourning might indeed be a performance, right? He's not the subject. This is not a portrait of him. What he's thinking is not the primary focus of this work, but he seems to be performing a kind of sadness. And so this is one of the sources of Kaphar's collage. If we look at the next one, this is another work. This is owned by the Getty Museum, Portrait of a Nurse and Child. And this is one of these unforgettable photographs showing really skin to skin this young white child and the young West African woman here with her headband, her scarf around her head. I mean, it's unforgettable, I think, because there's a feeling of intimacy, right? And at the same time, we're looking at forced labor and enslavement with the two beautiful people in a situation, right, that neither of them in this moment can help. This is a part of a genre of daguerreotypes known as mammy and child photographs. And this is the central image that you see in Nourishing a Nation. If we go to the next one, yes, this is also from the Yale University Art Gallery's collection, this Aikens painting, Rail Shooting, and the rail being a bird, rail shooting on the Delaware. And I do encourage you to look at the collection website for the University Art Gallery and looking at even how the title has changed over time, as Zirwat has mentioned. It's something that, as someone for me who's really interested in exhibitions and exhibition histories, its labels are really fascinating. And so I encourage you to look at how that has changed as well. So showing these two men in a way that almost shows them as collaborators in this act of killing and hunting the birds. The Black man is indeed standing taller than the man with the gun, with his shoes off, gripping the end of the kayak, and then also steadying with the oar. And again, he is not the subject, but he is shown to be important and to be an assistant. And so we see I think in each of these examples, different ways in which, I won't say it's a development, but I'll say different ways in which Black bodies have been used to kind of steady and fix whiteness in paintings. So if we'll go to the next one, I think we're just looking at Kafar's work again. There's a pile of heads of 19th century businessmen from a book that Kafar was looking at, the history of studio photography. And I'm not showing you a separate slide for that, but just wanted to let you know that source. I think it helps to know the research, to look at the original context for the work, and then to look at Kafar's work, think about the title, and think about over time how these different representations come together to support an argument that he's making through the title of the work. We think about wet nurses when we think about mammies. We think about the nourishment of Black labor when we look at the Fontaine and Porter. We also think about shooting the birds and the Black man who's an assistant of that. But then this pile of heads at the bottom, right? What are the stories of each of those people? How did they become wealthy businessmen, right? What nourished them? What sustained them? What is the role of Black people and a visual documentation of Blackness, fictional and non-fictional, in American art that helps to construct a nation, I think are some of the things to think about here. If we go over to the next slide, I wanted to just give you some examples of other Black artists who have been thinking about portraiture and Black subjectivity. One example from Carrie Mae Weems from her series, From Here, I Saw What Happened and I Cried from 1995. So I'm showing you a photograph, a daguerreotype by Thomas Easterly on the left. And then from the series, Carrie Mae Weems, using etched glass as an overlay to this photograph colored red in a portrait circle, right, to create a kind of portraiture context, and then giving language and voice acknowledging the Black woman's place from her perspective, right? Acknowledging her story. Your resistance was found in a foodie place on a master's table. Ha! Right? That there's a liveliness to that. There's a story that's there. There's a passion. I think that Zirwat, when she was talking about resistance and slave rebellions and setting fires to plantations, right? This is something that we're also seeing in Weems' work. If we go to the next slide, we can see an untitled work by Kafar, an early work for him in which he made the daguerreotype into a painting and then did an early cutout showing a different arrangement, a kind of intimacy, a way in which a constructed family, forced labor organization was created. And it's untitled. I think we can think about it conceptually along the lines of nourishing a nation, right? And thinking about this woman's role, nourishing these children and likely the father as well. And this may be a memorial photograph for the man's wife who is not present. We go to the next slide, another example from 1940 to 1941, Jacob Lawrence's Migration of the Negro, his first widely acclaimed artwork, and thinking about the Great Migration through this work. This is an installation photograph of it at MoMA in 1942. And then in the next slide, we'll see a very recent revisioning of that work by Zaveria Simmons. I'll stop here, thank you, just to show you the first of the 60 panels that make up the artwork for people who are unfamiliar with it, showing the masses of people telling a story and focusing on the individual people who were part of the Great Migration. And then the next one, we'll look at a response by Zaveria Simmons, The Whole United States is Southern. And what she's doing here in this response, not in an aggressive way, but really as an homage to Lawrence's work, using some of these colors from his 60 panel series dispersed throughout this enormous installation, really a mural size installation. And in the language that she uses, this is one of the great things that I love about this piece. It's much more direct and it's much more condemning than Lawrence was able to present in his work in terms of his address. The history of racism and exclusion in the United States is the history of whiteness, right? I mean, the directness there is something that is so powerful for this piece and something that makes the work for some viewers much less palatable than what is considered to be a kind of modern primitive approach, right? And I use that sort of italicized or in quotation marks that we see with Jacob Lawrence's work, at least in the way that it was received by the mainstream art world in the 1940s. We can go to the next image, please. Yeah, this is just a detail. You know, I want to say this about this work. This is not traditional portraiture. It's not figuration. And yet this is a portrait of a people. There are voices here. There's a centering of Blackness, as my colleagues have used the phrase. There's a way in which Black voices are very present, and they are the source of information. They are the most important thing in the work of art. And that is part of claiming Black subjectivity. We can go to the next slide. I'll end here looking at the Yale painting, which my colleagues have talked so eloquently about already. If we go to the next slide, just the last thing that I wanted to say in terms of what I think Kafar is doing here, right? So the crumpling that Edward has mentioned, the framing, right? And we think about Carrie Mae Weems' work in creating that circular frame for the Black face as a shift to portraiture, a visual strategy to make the Black person visible. As Edward mentioned, when Kafar painted this, he left the collar off. I also want to bring our attention to the fact that the young boy is looking out at us, that Kafar has changed the boy's gaze. So he's not looking at the white men anymore. He's not looking at the Yales anymore. He's looking at us, right? And this is something that we think about with James Baldwin's work and his thoughts about direct address. This is a way of visually making a claim to Black subjectivity. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for these really enlightening presentations. And it's really striking to see how there are so many connections between each of your varying sort of different ways of coming about to this type of research. And I want to start off with just a very broad question about the fact that why we're here today in the first place. I mean, a whole pandemic has occurred, right? We're still kind of in the midst of it. And we're all being brought together, and we have been in the last year and a half over Zoom in these ways where we're able to bring people away, you know, from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, even to come and have conversations. And there are recent events, of course, that have also occurred during this period too. And I'd like to note just sort of something that you've all touched upon in your presentations, and I brought up in the beginning of my introduction about these recent events, about the Black Lives Matter protests, the continued hypervisibility of violence in the media, and the toppling of these monuments, which is something that has been a conversation ongoing for years and years and years. And it's a conversation that's happened, that's ebbed and flowed, given the certain political context in which we're in. I want to know if we could just talk generally about how this has impacted your teaching, your writing, your research. And do you envision any real change that's sort of occurring or not, or at what pace? And what are some of the ways you think we can shift this discipline towards more of an inclusivity as a way of centering and thinking about Black and Brown representation and portraits in that context?
I can start if we're waiting for somebody to start. I think about this a lot. So I'll just say a couple of things. Yes, the pandemic has definitely impacted my teaching and in different unexpected ways. I think my students have been really hungry to connect and some of them have been checked out. They have a lot of other things going on in their lives. And this pandemic has exacerbated some very practical living conditions. And others have been able to really tune in and find themselves with the ability to focus on the relationship between visual culture and the quality of lives of people all over the world. So I never expect real substantive change. I do think that we can make gestures and we can do things through museums and through the artists who are really the visionaries that are going to get us out of this mess of racism and exclusion. I think there are ways that we can collaborate. And maybe part of what you may be thinking about, Maryam, is how our condition has focused us and made it possible to collaborate in ways across distance and time and place, that we were unwilling to do before. I really applaud the Yale Center for addressing the permanent collection. And when I think about museums and the possibility of change, and I think about the changing identities of museums and the way that they can be more accurate and inclusive and can listen, it does have a lot to do with permanent collection. And so I was really excited to hear Edward talk about all of the research and commitment that's happened there. And I'm hoping to see that same kind of commitment to objects in the permanent collection and rethinking them in other places.
Zirwat or Ed, would you like to respond?
I think for us, the project at Journal 18 really came both in response to, in conversation with the events and the singular convergence, right, of calls for racial justice and life in lockdown, and what that illuminated also about the purported freedom to move and who gets to move and who doesn't. How is that also a mode of historical relation? But in my own teaching, I think what's interesting is that when the question gets posed of as of last summer, but of course the task has been before us for much longer. I mean, this didn't just start last summer. I think engaging with histories of not just colonization and racism, but also understanding different iterations of personhood within these histories. And I think that's something that Bridget was probably nodding to as well, right? Is how in expanding the parameters of a genre called portraiture, the task is not just how do we envision other people and other peoples as participants within it, but how does it actually fundamentally require us to reimagine the conceptual categories of what is a portrait as well. So I think, these are tasks, and it makes teaching actually more fun, because the task, I think, for us is not just to get up in front of our students and pass on that which we had once ingested, but really also to learn with them. I think sometimes it can be challenging because the students have a lot of desires and needs and demands that they want our curricula to offer them. And yet sometimes channeling that is also a way to see the real potential of the work that we do, right? That this isn't just, I teach 18th and 19th century European art. It's, hardly like, oh, I'm doing the greatest hits of, whiteness in the 18th and 19th century. A lot of my work has been about how do we demystify Black presence in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries without necessarily contributing histories of erasures, but making room for these histories of resistance, liberation, and understanding the limits that they often met as well. So I think that fundamentally requires reimagining something called European art as a relational category, rather than as this kind of ascendance of Western civilization.
Ed, did you want to respond to the question?
The only thing I'll add is to sort of Bridget's kind words is something very powerful about bringing work like Titus Kafar's Enough About You into the center, because I think it just absolutely reinforces the importance of sustaining that focus. I mean, people have been, whether it's Fred Wilson or, the curators who worked on the figures of empire, people have been thinking about this a long time before, but it's so important just to maintain that focus, particularly at a place like the Yale Center for British Art, which is fortunate to be nested within a university that has good resources and lots of different types of expertise. We have the scientific instrumentation at our disposal, but it's a good place to do this work. It's just important that it continues. I'll also say it goes alongside incredible work that Zirwat's done in, I think, something so powerful about aggregating this number of portraits, the history becomes undeniable, and the importance of studying it and considering it in various ways, it will remain.
And in some ways, what this sort of comes to, and again, back to thinking about how we're all together and how we're now crowdsourcing in a sense. Zirwat, you crowdsourced this timeline. You collaborated with scholars and historians and curators across the globe to come up with that collaborative timeline for Ed, in terms of thinking about how we might establish and bring in multiple narratives into the museum is something that we've been thinking about. And that's also something in terms of the way that we teach art history, that, this sort of idea that there isn't a monolithic narrative, but there is instead a narrative that we should express that encounters and thinks about these multiple voices and multiplicities of histories. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, maybe in terms of, at least Ed, about how we can draw on this sort of idea of crowdsourcing, how we can draw upon multiple narratives and voices in our own sort of respective research and teaching.
I think it's very important to draw upon the power of the crowd, so to speak, because many of these histories have been neglected or forgotten. And for me, just the act of, as I mentioned before, what Zirwat has done with her colleagues, taking advantage of the fact that collections are now digitized. It's now possible in a way that it was never possible before to bring together such a large, what I would see as a critical mass of visual data, etc., which has a powerfully transformative effect on the way in which we think about these histories.
I think if I could just add one thing, we want to always think so much about the scope and potential and the energizing power of crowdsourced projects or collaborative projects, but it really also requires just letting go of a lot of things. And I think that was one of the big reasons why we didn't want the timeline to be like detailed, like here is our hot take on each artwork. There was something about, as much as the crowdsourcing was the way in which we compiled it, we wanted to equally leave it to the hands of those who were going to come and use the timeline to make the connections that they wanted to make as well. And I think it's certainly a new practice for me, right? Because we get used to these are our narratives. We want our audiences to walk away with the narratives we've transmitted to them. And the truth is that I think what you hope is that through the act of collaboration, we also get to learn about one another a little bit and learn to share vocabularies, if not just to start passively speaking the same language. And I think that act is also really important.
I want to just turn to just a couple of questions from our audience, and we'll also talk about some of the questions and points of discussion that we have as well. But since, Zirwat, you're on the discussion about your timeline, there's one question from the audience member, Beth Lonesberry, who asks, are these elements of your timeline that you have compiled to be used to adjust, and this is in quote marks, adjust and add to the curriculum of students in public schools?
Thank you for that question. If I've understood it correctly, the nice thing about having a digital timeline, our journal is not behind a paywall, it's openly accessible. We certainly are welcoming educators, be it K through 12, be it, college level, be it whatever other arena to be using the timeline. But I think for starters, it's just nice to have something that students can also access out of their own interest. And I think I often find that our very digital savvy students are not requiring always educators to introduce them to resources. They're usually able to come to a lot of it themselves. But certainly, I think what for me resonates in your question is, for example, UCLA, we, very proud of the fact that we have many students who come through the community college system. And it's really interesting to see what we are able to offer within the art history curriculum in the UCs and what the art history curriculum still looks like in high schools and in the community college as well. And a lot of that has to do with what are the kind of support and resources available to educators as well. If you're teaching 8 courses a year, you're not really given the time to reimagine how you want to replot that curriculum as well. So I think we want to talk about, yes, here's all the innovation, but a lot of it is support your educators. And it means doing so at, elementary school, middle school, high school, and community college level.
Great. I think that one of the questions, this is sort of It's a question that seems to have a gray area. There's this sort of answers is something that we've been trying to grapple with in the museums, but also in terms of art history. And that is thinking about these images as being traumatic images of violence, traumatic images of terror that could be potentially harmful to some viewers. And some say that these are harmful images. Others say that we see worse in terms of what we've seen in the last year and a half. There has been in social media, again, going back to George Floyd's murder, who was shown on social media. I mean, it was inescapable, something I couldn't watch myself, but there's this connection between what's happening out there, what was happening last summer, and thinking about the images that we've even seen today in some of the images of the works that we talked about. And I just kind of want to talk about what you think about this notion of these traumatic images. Do we keep these images up in the gallery? Do we show them to our students? Do we talk about them? Just keeping them away from being seen on view, erase a part of our history? Is it important for us to even look back on our history to remember the problems and ills and the violence of what happened before? And yeah, I just sort of want to think about that sort of conversation. Something that's been really important to thinking about whether or not do we keep up, images of enslaved children, or if that is potentially traumatic to students, potentially traumatic to viewers. And I know with you, Bridget, I know you've talked in an article about teaching your students about lynch mob imagery in photography. So it would be great just to talk about this.
Yeah, thanks, Maryam, because I also think a lot about this. So I will say there's no one answer to the question. I think this is an exercise and a challenge for, if we're going to say curators, if we're going to say museum directors, to really think about their context and who they want to prioritize as their audience. There have been plenty of controversies and missteps where museums think they're doing the right things and then they're criticized by people who say you're being insensitive. We can think about the Philip Guston show and what's going on there, right? Where the exhibition is being delayed for so many years. And I'm wondering, well, what's going to happen between now and when the exhibitions are going to be up? Museums are trying, I will honestly say, I think very few museums, but some museums are really trying to rethink their approach. I think for some museums, the idea of showing solidarity with Black Lives Matter is considered a kind of PR issue, that they're not thinking about it in terms of presentation, extending themselves in vulnerable ways with communities that they have not been in communication with before. But for those who are really trying, they need to be able to account for their collection. And if they're going to put it up, they need to figure out what they want to say about it. And they need to criticize where criticism is appropriate. And they can't stand silent on things. When we go back to mining the museum, I think for Wilson to show these works such as slave shackles, right? And people were really appalled. I mean, people who were part of the Maryland Historical Society, don't show this. It's like, well, you have it. Why do you have it? You think it's valuable. How, and then for Wilson, his challenge was to figure out how can I present the work in a way that shows truth and criticality. That's the hard work. Artists know how to do that, but museums have to catch up. I mean, 1992 is when that show happened. And it's like, okay, are we doing this again? So artists are pointing us in the right direction, which is the left direction. But artists can only do what they do, right? The institutions are the ones that have to take up the clues and decide this is what we want to do in the future. You're not going to be able to please everyone. So you have to figure out what is important to you as an institution. So yeah, there's no one solution. And if it's being done in a superficial way, the audience will know.
Could I just add, Maryam, you even gave the example of Bridget's work and with students and with lynching photography in particular. And I still remember my first year of graduate school seeing the Without Sanctuary exhibition at the Chicago Historical Society. And one of the things that was actually really striking is we talk so much now in our recollection of that exhibition of the photographs. And what was so provocative for me was seeing what was on the other side of the postcards. And the fact that people were circulating these images and writing commentary like went to Sunday, the Sunday roast, essentially. And so I think, to me, like, it doesn't have the terror of the image, but it has the terror of the normalization of terror itself. So I think they're, like, to Bridget's point, they're really imaginative ways to bring attention to those things without participating in the spectacularization of violence on Black bodies necessarily either. So I think if we want to be, we want to be like, we're art historians, it's images, 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 we lose sight of all the ways in which we learn to have relationships with images as well. So I think, in the same way, like, to me, actually, it's really distressing to see the hunting rifle photographs, because as I do in my own work, guns were a big part of the network of the slave trade. So guns were sent from Europe to West Africa and across, in fact, West and East Africa in exchange, as it was a big catalyst for the slave trade as well. So, we might not see those as similarly violent images, but, as I tried to do in my own work, it's there.
Right. It's really interesting because we've been talking about this, always bring up Saidiya Hartman when we talk about these things, Venus in Two Acts, Scenes of Subjection, where she talks about how the notion of terror being unrepresentable. So in a sense, maybe if it fails to really represent that power or that terror, it just merely perpetuates it instead in some ways, or to think about the mundaneness of terror, of violence, of those sort of chapters in that history, and whether or not we're reifying those kinds of things by looking at those images or talking about those images. And I wonder if we can make any connections between thinking about these monuments being taken down. In the last year, this is a conversation that happened, really was sparked by Charlottesville. There's been a conversation for years and years and years, since the 90s, especially with the Colston Monument. And I think it would be great just to maybe talk about, because that was sort of the catalyst, I think, for me at least, when thinking about portraiture in the first place, was public monuments, these Confederate monuments. I was a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, and for the longest time, we had Confederate monuments lining the central entrance to the university. And we had conversations with my students about whether or not we should take those down. And back then, it seemed like a gray area. It seemed like something that you could argue for or against. They belong in a museum, being contextualized. They don't belong in a museum. They should stay. They should remain. And I think it would be interesting to think about the differences between the museum space, the public space, just to have a conversation about that generally. And I think with the M. Shedd Museum, they're crowdsourcing their visitors and asking, what should we do with the Colston statue? And I think one of the interesting things about the way they display that statue is not back up on its Portland stone plinth in the museum, but on its side, showing that history of what happened to it. And I know maybe Ed can talk a little bit about this, about us crowdsourcing our website visitors about display.
Absolutely. There's a means by which if people visit the web story on the main website, there's an invitation for people to share their thoughts about what happens next. Just returning, Maryam, to your previous question, just for a second about what to do and what not to do. And clearly there's no right or wrong. The only thing I'd say is that the painting we've been talking about today, the group portrait, by coincidence, is the first painting that's formally accessioned into the Yale Center for British Arts collection. Its accession number is B 1970.1. It was the first thing through the door, before there were doors. The center opens in 1977. Now, between 1970 and 2014, this painting was not on display. And all I'll say is that while it hung in storage, or for a period of time was in a residential college, there's very little was said or written or thought about it. So there is, if you just relegate something to storage, it can sometimes just take it out of, it's not front of mind for people. It comes to the Figures of Empire exhibition in 2014, and in 2016, Titus Gaffar creates a work from it, which has an impact. That's what I mentioned about the politics of whether or not to display or not to display.
Well, While we're here, I'd like to maybe look at some of the questions again from the audience. And this is one that's directed towards the center generally. Will the Allahu Yale portrait return to the wall or not? What is the next step for that object and how is it represented in the collection? And without the kafar as a reaction, how will it be displayed on its own? Do we have those answers yet?
Those answers, yeah. Currently, the Titus kafar has returned to the lenders. And at the moment, on the fourth floor, neither painting is on that wall. It's intentionally left blank. And it's providing an opportunity to pause and consider as to what comes next. As I mentioned earlier, research is ongoing. So we've reached an important milestone, but it really hasn't finished. There's work continues in the archive, and a conversation has begun in earnest as what will be the best display strategy for this complicated picture.
I just loved when Bridget and Ed both did the detail of the kafar work with the portrait of the attendant, and just this even, Bridget reminding us that he's shifting his gaze away from the figures, right, to looking at us. And I love that because I think one of the things that I mentioned to, my co-panelists when we were having conversations before is that for me, this work is so powerful because there is a law in the slave code in the colonies from the 1660s about punishment by death for any enslaved person who compasses or imagines the death of a white person. And so I love that the kafar stages this moment of destruction of white portraiture in a way as well, something that would have had a very different future for the Black sitter in that portrait as well. And I think, in that way, I'm not saying that the Yale Center for British Art needs to destroy its portrait, but I think it asks this question of, when we look at the historical tallies of bodies that have been, meted punishment, including death, and works of art that have managed to survive against all odds, there is a little bit of reckoning to do as well. And I think that's also to the credit of a contemporary artist like Titus Kafar to make room for that act of destruction while leaving that work intact. And I thought that was really a profoundly moving gesture toward the history of something that would have been so risky for the sitter on the right as well.
Well, I want to ask one more question to Ed, and I hate to monopolize your time, but this comes from David Benman, and he wants to know about the slave collar. He says, one almost unique feature of the Devonshire portrait is that the slave collar, and especially the very obvious lock. How do you account for its prominence?
How do I account for its prominence? That's a very good question. It's not the only depiction of a padlock collar. I can think of about 60 portraits or so made in Britain in the 17th and 18th century that depict such collars, some of which were clearly inscribed. We have another portrait in the centre's collection, which depicts a young white girl alongside a young boy of African heritage who is wearing a similar collar, terminating, I think, in what is a padlock. And alongside is a dog who's wearing a collar upon which something is written, which might give us clues as to the identity of the sitters eventually. All I can say is that it's particularly distressing to see the padlock, but I think all of the collars would have been closed in that manner. It's a grim aspect of the past, but the same people who manufacture dog collars were the people, as we know from David Olusoga's work, who would manufacture the collars worn by these children and adults as well in Britain. And they're not made in such a way as to tether the wearer to any other shackle or chain. It's really, so far as I understand it, is to deter self-emancipation and the recovery if someone chose to run away.
So we have about a few minutes left, and I think maybe we have time for one closing remarks and maybe one more question. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about, and especially in terms of the way some of these images are represented, is this idea of absence and presence, and how that, which is absent materially, historically, visually, how can we represent that as that which is absent? And I'm thinking not only about the absence within the archival record and the history of some of these subjects, but also in terms of the absence of these images, of certain types of images within these portraits and paintings themselves, but also, just those kinds of things, and kind of thinking about how can we represent that which is absent in terms of those things, in terms of the archival record, in terms of visually, how can we represent that in art history and the teaching of these historical narratives? How do we represent that in the museum? And I know this is such a broad question, but it really, it's something that we should think about. So do you have any final thoughts?
It's kind of an incomplete thought, but I was thinking about, the whole United States is Southern, that work by Simmons, and the fact that it doesn't have any figures in it. It is a conceptual piece, and it also makes me think about, as you're talking about absence and the possibility of abstraction being another strategy to try to get people to understand the possibility of Black subjectivity, right? Not in a way that's portraiture in the traditional sense, in a kind of claiming of the Black body in portraiture, but that there's possibilities that are exponential, I think, in other kinds of approaches that make a presence in a different way, right? Not on par with the white figures, but something that is infiltrating, something that's in the artwork, but also in the museum, in the bodies of the people who are looking in our imagination to think about where Blackness is. That might be beyond having a Black figure, right? I think that artists are working hard to sort of change the terms of portraiture and Black subjectivity.
I think that's also interesting in terms of, again, thinking about the archive itself as a colonized space, right? And how, we're talking about white figures and Black figures together in different ways. And one of the things that Ed had mentioned, which is really interesting, is thinking about how in some ways the Black figure in these paintings is living. They're the ones that are showing that kind of life, because for better or for worse, they're the ones working while you have these people just sitting around or whatever. But in terms of the sort of archive itself being a colonized space where the agency of some of these lives are not maybe necessarily there, and we've got to find ways of maybe coming to that, or we're reading the lives of these people through the accounts of slave owners or the ship captains or whatever. And I think it's interesting to think about that in that way. We are out of time, but I would like to hear any more final thoughts. If Zirwat, you would like to say anything, or Bridget or Ed, before we go.
Quickly in that matter of erasure, that I think is also a question of emphasis. I'm always struck that we hear white subjects or white sitters and Black figures. So where there's the slippage in terminology always versus figuration as a kind of practice and convention. But also equally, I think, just to piggyback off the question earlier, David Byman asked, even the emphasis on the color, like there are ways in which we always want to accrue histories of subordination. And I think one of the reasons I want to emphasize the history of like Black reproductive labor and women's reproductive labor and the histories of sexual violence is because there's never any room to imagine, or rarely room to imagine, that these children were likely the children of white men as well. That men like Yaya were known to keep South Asian companions while they were in South Asia, practice that keeps ongoing. And that when you look at the archival records, when they would leave India, they would leave the woman to a friend of theirs. So I think it's we always we want to imagine, these are, yes, enslaved bodies and all of that, but we forget the various dispossessions of kinship that go into making these portraits as well. So I would just say that, to your point about absence, it's that I think things are there before us. We just have to learn to look better.
That's a great note to end on. And I think that this was a much needed discussion. And I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Ed. I want to thank Bridget and Zirwat for a really great, engaging conversation, and to hear more about your research and thinking about Black representation and portraiture. And I also want to thank the audience for joining us as well. And before I let you all go, I just want to let you know that our second panel for this program will convene on August 6th with curators Liz Andrews, Christine Kim, Denise Morrell, Killy Orgaman, and then, of course, our artist conversation with Titus Kafar on September 17th. Thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you to our panelists.
Thanks so much.